Welcome back in. I hope all of you are having a good start to your Tuesday. We're here in the Outkick studios. And let me say this right off the top. I want to talk about the idea of a super league being formed in college football, but I'm not in favor of it, right? So we just talked about this to finish off the first hour. And if you're just waking up with us, by the way, encourage you to go download the first hour. Search out my name, Clay Travis. Search out Outkick. Baylor men's basketball coach Scott Drew was our guest. We're going to be joined in the next segment by John Morosi, our Major League Baseball insider. I'm not saying that I'm for this idea that's coming out of the discussion surrounding the college universe here that's coming out of soccer. I'm saying I feel like it is the best analogy that you could draw to exactly what is going on in soccer. And the best way I think you can think about this is it possible that the money in college football could, in the years ahead, become so substantial that a super conference of sorts could emerge? And if that is true, what might it look like? And so, by the way, early test on this is going to come soon because the Pac-12's deal is up before long. The Big 12's deal is up before long. So the SEC and a lot of other schools are locked down basically for a generation. But there's an argument out there that USC could have a more viable future as an independent college than they do as a member of the Pac-12. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it's out there. Texas in the Big 12 has always flirted with the idea of being independent. Oklahoma and Texas are by far the most valuable brands inside of the Big 12. But if we were going to suddenly have like a 20-team mega conference, and I'm not saying I'm in favor of it, and I'm not saying it's going to happen, what would that look like? Which teams would actually be draftable as a part of this breakaway if suddenly the long-term commitments to conferences was not the same? And by the way, the analogy, the reason why I would compare this to European soccer is the English Premier League is kind of like the Southeastern Conference. And Serie A is kind of like the Big Ten. And La Liga in Spain can kind of be like the Pac-12. And the Bundesliga can kind of be like the ACC. And that's the analogy that I would draw. All of these European soccer federations where the teams all compete there, and then they compete in a larger Champions League, that's kind of the analogy that you could draw here. Okay? Which teams would be in it? Now, I'll start with you. I just kind of get your read on this, Dub. Do you pay attention to soccer at all?
Yeah, I do. Not as much as I used to a few years ago, but I definitely keep an eye on it, for sure.
Would you agree with my Super League analogy being most apt in terms of American sports now, using college football as the example?
Yeah, I think it's a great comparison. I think it checks every box because it really is unique in a sense where there's so many different separate leads. The only thing
regional leagues.
Exactly. And the only thing you could really compare it to, I think, is college football here in the United States.
And now the positive, I guess, about this Super League in general is it's not as if in soccer suddenly the EPL would cease to exist. So that's the difference and why I don't think it's necessarily going to happen. But if the goal was to make as much money as possible, a lot of times these major conferences don't necessarily make as much sense because there's an unequal bargaining power, by which I mean this. Ohio State is far more valuable than Rutgers. But in conference, they share television revenue. Even though there's probably not a single person out there who would watch a Rutgers game over Ohio State that's not a Rutgers alum, right? Michigan is far more valuable than, and I'm not trying to take shots at anybody here, than Purdue, right? Michigan football, far more valuable than Purdue, okay? And every conference has a ranked order of what the brand value is of the conference. And so the easy way to think about this is, let's pretend the Big Ten suddenly didn't have Michigan and Ohio State. How much less value would the Big Ten have? I think no way the remaining 12 schools are worth any more than half of what they might have been worth before, with Michigan and Ohio State included. And that might be an exaggeration to even get them to half, right? In other words, my argument would be Michigan and Ohio State football represents at least half of the value nearly of the Big Ten as a whole. And look, there are other schools with big values, Penn State, Wisconsin. Like, we can run through what exactly those schools would be, but the larger picture here is the business value of football is where all the money comes from. And I should start there, by the way, of just pointing this out. Even successful college basketball programs are nowhere near as valuable as big football programs, all right? So, who would be like the 20 schools that would end up in a super conference if you were breaking it down? I think the easiest place to go for this is just to look at the overall revenues that are being produced. And that gives you a rough idea, because revenue valuations can, increase or decrease over time depending on a particular year and everything else. But in general, that's where I think you would go to find out where the best revenues are. And this is not going to stun anybody who's listening to me right now in the state of Texas, but the two most valuable college football programs right now, which is the vast majority of the overall revenue, Texas and Texas A&M. So the super conference would include Texas, and it would include Texas A&M. And then I just talked about Ohio State and Michigan. The third and the fourth highest revenue athletic departments in the country are Ohio State and Michigan. And then again, this can fluctuate based on whether you make the college football playoff or whether you make the Final Four on a year-to-year basis. But Georgia, right now, in the most recent year, fifth biggest college program. Penn State, Alabama, Oklahoma, Florida, and LSU is the top 10. And so I think you would be hard-pressed out there to argue that any of those top 10 would not be included in, let's say, a 20-team super conference. Then the 11th most lucrative team out there, Wisconsin. Florida State gets up here, but they have a bunch of subsidies which wouldn't ordinarily be included. I would put Florida State on the borderline. Auburn, Iowa, Kentucky, Tennessee, South Carolina, Michigan State, Louisville, and Arkansas are the 20 highest revenue programs. All right? 20 highest. What about outside of the top 20? Are there any brands that are so valuable you would think right now they would have to be in the super conference? Well, Clemson's listed at 22. I think it would be hard for a super conference to not include Clemson right now, just based on how good they are. Nebraska historically has been great. They're at 21. And then you start to run through and you think, hey, what about, like, and by the way, private schools are not listed here. So USC would certainly be included. UCLA's pretty far down the list. Would they need to be included? What about, I think it's fascinating. What states would you decide to put in there? North Carolina, for instance, is 36 on this list. I am fascinated by who the 20 would be. Washington is 23rd. Oregon is 26th. You would want a geographically diverse number of teams, and a lot of places would not want the same schools in the same state. Notre Dame, Dub, would have to be in this list, another private school that isn't listed. You can see how much of a fight this would end up being if you said, hey, we only want 20. What stands out to you about the revenue-producing schools I just went through, Dub?
Well, regionally, there's not a whole lot of diversity. There's a lot of SEC teams and schools in the southern portion of the United States, which I don't think is necessarily a surprise to anybody.
Yeah, I think so. Let's start here. Let's make our list. And we may have to carry this even into the third hour a little bit because this can be a long-form discussion. But let's start with private schools. I think there are only 2 private schools that would make our list of the super conference schools. I think USC and Notre Dame are it. Would you agree with me on that? I don't think Northwestern would be in. I don't think Vanderbilt. Duke is not good enough in football. Wake Forest. Again, we're not making basketball very important in this decision. Would you agree with me that the only 2 private schools that would be in our 20-team conference would be USC and Notre Dame?
I would agree, and I think you could put maybe TCU on the outside looking in terms of private
TCU's
schools.
Another good private. Baylor has been very good. We just talked with Baylor basketball coach Scott Drew. I don't think Baylor's basketball program is big enough. So I would say we only have 2 private schools, SC and Notre Dame. All right. What about Big Ten schools and let's just go with there's no way they could be left out. And maybe at the start of the third hour, because we've got John Morosi coming up, and I want to talk a little bit about Alex Smith, too. At the start of the third hour, we can get into the difficult decisions that would have to be made. In the Big Ten, the 100% in Michigan, Ohio State, right?
Absolutely.
And I think you probably have to also put in Penn State.
I would agree with that.
Okay. So we have 3 definites, Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State. In the private school, we got USC and Notre Dame. All right, SEC. And I do think the challenge here is college football is very Southern biased, right? And I think you have to think a little bit historically, but I would say Alabama and Auburn are both in, right? I'm going to start off in the SEC West. I would say Texas A&M is in just based on the size of A&M. I think that LSU is in. Those would be the 4 in the SEC West that I would say have to be in, right? I would also tell you for the SEC East, I don't think there's any doubt about Florida. I don't think there's any doubt about Georgia. I think based on the size of the program and the history and the stadium and the draw and everything else, Tennessee would have to be in. So I think you would take half the SEC. I think definitively Alabama, Auburn, Texas A&M, LSU, Florida, Georgia, Tennessee. All right, those are definites to me. I think in the ACC, I could make an argument to you that the only 2 that really belong are Clemson and FSU. And by the way, I might have to circle back up on my private school list. Miami, Hurricanes borderline. I'm going to put a question mark beside Miami because they are a private school as well. But I would say in the ACC, the only 2 schools that would get in would be Clemson and FSU. I really do think that. All right, in the Big 12, I think you probably are only talking about 2 schools. I think it's Texas and I think it's Oklahoma in terms of major foundational brands. And then in the Pac-12, we already have SC in. Oregon and Washington, maybe? I'm not sure both of those schools get in. So let me tally where our numbers are. 2 in the Big 12, 2 in the Pac-12, 3 if you count SC, 7 in the SEC, 2 in the ACC, and 3 in the Big Ten. And I think we need to circle back to the Big Ten. And I would say I think Wisconsin probably gets in. And then I think there are interesting questions about Nebraska because historically the answer would be yes. What about right now? I'm not sure exactly. All right, so let me go through. I'm jotting this down as we go through. Notre Dame in as an independent. So let me count them. I've got Texas and Oklahoma in the Big 12. I've got Oregon, Washington, and USC in the Pac-12. I have got Clemson and FSU in the ACC. As an independent school, I have got Notre Dame. In the Big Ten, I have got Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State, and Wisconsin. And then in the SEC, I've got Alabama, Auburn, Texas A&M, LSU, Florida, Georgia, and Tennessee. I think that gets us to 19. And so Nebraska or Miami would be my 20th school potentially to get in. What do you think about that 20 super conference, Dub? Who else would you say has a strong argument? I think if you're an Iowa fan, you could be like, hey, wait a minute, Iowa needs to be in. I think you could argue, I think it's hard to argue anybody other, frankly, than Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State, and Wisconsin to be in the Big Ten.
As a matter of fact, over the commercial break before this segment, I just jotted down conference by conference, then independent being Notre Dame, the teams I would put in. I got to 20 on my own, and I have everybody on your list, but I have included Miami out of the ACC as well.
You took Miami over Nebraska?
I did. Just based off of, they both have great history. Miami's certainly more recent in terms of the long-term success, but I had Miami over Nebraska.
I think there could be a battle in the Big Ten between Wisconsin and Nebraska, right? Because historically, Wisconsin football has been pretty good lately, but historically, Nebraska has dominated if you were looking at the history of Wisconsin or Nebraska. And certainly this is a Southern dominant list, but the South dominates college football in general. I don't think we'll debate this at the start of the third hour again. So I went ahead and gave you my entire list. I don't really think you could argue for anybody else in the Big 12. I really don't. I don't really think you could argue for anybody else in the Pac-12. And I think I'm being generous putting Oregon and Washington both in because historically that wouldn't be reflected. You could argue maybe for UCLA, but I think if you've got SC, I think it would be hard to argue UCLA. And you just pointed out, Dub, 12 Southern teams and 8 non-Southern teams, so it's not even that
the 4
slanted.
Out of the Big Ten, the 3 out of the Pac-12, and then Notre Dame. That's 8 teams out of this 20 that are not from the South. So
you think we're being pretty fair here in the way that we are assessing?
I really do, because when you think about college football and the Southern dominance, dominance is, you would think, more than 12 of 20, I think.
Yeah.